In this series of videos, we're going to be looking at molecules that we call carbohydrates, which are the first of 4 different families of large molecules that are found in all living things. Now, if we break apart the word carbohydrates, it actually tells us a lot about the structure of how these molecules work. So we can see from the prefix that carbohydrates definitely contain the element carbon, and if we know that the hydra suffix means water, that tells us that we can also find water molecules within carbohydrates too. In fact, we can use this information in order to come up with a general formula that describes most carbohydrates, and that formula is where the letter N represents the number of carbons. That means that we would also have an equal amount of water molecules. So the general formula CnH2O in brackets N, although you will also see it written like this, CnH2nOn. And again, this is the same thing, just expanded outward. Now we can check this generalized formula by looking at possibly the most well-known carbohydrate molecule, a molecule that we call glucose. Now, if you remember from when we learned about how energy is produced in living things, glucose has the chemical formula C6H12O6. So here we can see that 6 represents N, that being the number of carbons. And if we break down the water component here, we have H12. 12 would be 2N, and 6 would be N as well. So we can clearly see that glucose follows the general formula that we came up with here. Now, this general formula doesn't actually apply to all carbohydrate molecules. It only applies to the simplest example of carbohydrate molecules, which are what we call monosaccharides. So if we break down this word, mono is obviously the prefix for one, and saccharide is the scientific word that refers to sugar. Now, that's because sugars are the common name for carbohydrates. So glucose is actually a major component of the table sugar that is included in food. Now, this first video is going to cover the structure and chemistry of carbohydrates, and there are actually 2 different ways to represent the structures of monosaccharides or singular carbohydrates. There's what we call a chain structure represented by this structure on the left, and the ring structure that is represented by this structure on the right here. Now we can look at 2 different aspects of the chain structure and the ring structure here. The first of which that we're going to look at is the actual structure itself. So because glucose is the singularly most important sugar, one of the skills that you're going to need to be able to do is replicate the structure of glucose in a ring structure like this. And the way to do this is actually simpler than this monstrous full structure here, because we're going to convert this into a line structure. So if we look, we know that glucose is C6H12O6. We can see that all of the carbons are labeled 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we're going to draw them like that, starting with carbon 6 actually. So there's carbon 6. Here's carbon 5, 4, 3, 2, and then carbon 1. Now, normally we would draw the ring structure as a full hexagon, except we see that there's an oxygen in the ring structure connecting carbon 5 here with carbon 1 like that. So now we have our primary ring with all of the carbons in here, and now we just need a recognizable pattern for the OH groups that we see. So we can see, if we look at the bottom of the ring, that we have one OH group down, one OH group up, one OH group down, and one OH group up like this. Let me just redraw that neatly, like so. And then our final OH group is attached to carbon 6, and there is our ring structure of glucose. But the structure gets even easier, because if you were to draw it like this, so let's redraw the ring with the oxygen connecting carbon 1 and carbon 5, put the OH on the top group here, and then if we go down, up, down, and instead of going up for the last OH group, we go down. This is also a different form of glucose. So these two different forms are both glucose, but this is what we call the beta form of glucose, with this OH group on carbon 1 pointing up, and this conversely is what we call the alpha form of glucose, with this OH group on carbon pointing down. So there is a simple way to remember how to draw the structure of glucose. The next thing we need to take a look at is how to designate the numbering systems. So for anybody with a good organic chemistry background, identifying which carbon is number 1 is one of the most important skills in organic chemistry, because that allows us to find the front of the molecule versus the back of the molecule here. So we can identify this carbon here as carbon 1 because it's the only carbon in the entire glucose molecule that is bonded to 2 oxygens. Every other carbon in the molecule is only bonded to 1 oxygen. So identifying carbon 1 based on the one that's bonded to 2 oxygens is the easy way to identify where carbon 1 is, and then we would just count out the other carbon numbers in sequential order. So after 1 is 2, after 2 is 3, after 3 is 4, after 4 is 5, and finally at the back end of the molecule is carbon 6. Now that we have a solid understanding about how to read the structures of a monosaccharide, we can then talk about what happens when we combine multiple monosaccharides in order to produce molecules that we call disaccharides. So obviously the prefix di means 2, and saccharide is just the scientific word for sugar. So that means that we're going to be taking 2 sugar molecules and joining them together. And when we do that with 2 alpha glucose molecules, we can see these are the alpha form because the OH on carbon 1 is pointing down. When we connect these 2 glucose molecules using a chemical reaction, it produces an example of a disaccharide that we call maltose, which is a common type of sugar that is found in alcoholic beverages. Now, if we take this chemical reaction that is meant to join our monosaccharides together, and if we keep doing this indefinitely, we end up with a family of chemicals, or a family of carbohydrates rather, that we call polysaccharides. Now, for those people that know their word origins, you will recognize poly as the Greek prefix that simply means many. So again, what we're doing here is taking many monosaccharides on the order of hundreds, thousands, or even millions of them, and doing that same chemical reaction to string them together into very long chains. Now, the first example of a polysaccharide is a polysaccharide that we call starch, and this is a molecule that is primarily found in plants, and plants use this in order to store saccharide or monosaccharide molecules that it isn't using, and we're going to discuss the function of these in the next video. In animals, however, they don't have starch. Animals like us have a different polysaccharide, which is what we call glycogen. And if we look at the distinction between starch and glycogen, these long continuous structures here, where we take the monosaccharides and connect them into a singular chain, this is what we call the primary chain. But when we have another chain that juts off of the primary chain like this is what we call a branch structure or a side branch structure. So we can see the main distinction between starch molecules and glycogen is that glycogen has significantly more branch type structures off of the side than starch does. And finally, the last example of a polysaccharide that we can see, again, is a structure that is only found in plants. This is a polysaccharide that is called cellulose, and we can see that cellulose only exists in straight chain structures here. We see that there are absolutely no side branches that exist in glycogen or even in some forms of starch like this. And instead, the singular chains of monosaccharides strung together are instead held together by hydrogen bonds, because once again, carbohydrates, the individual monosaccharides within them, are polar molecules, which means the attraction that forms between the oxygen on one and the hydrogen on the other are able to keep these chains held together. And in the next video, what we're going to look at is the different functions that exist for starch and glycogen, and the difference between them and cellulose, and why plants require cellulose but other animals do not.